Namaskar and a very good morning to all of you. In this 2 week refresher course on laws, democracy, and institutions, today we will discuss about governance of forest areas, laws related to forest areas. And in this context, we will primarily focus on Forest Rights Act 2006. Forest Rights Act 2006 is an important law because it gives many crucial rights to forest dwelling communities, including scheduled tribes. But apart from Forest Rights Act, there are different kind of laws in our country which are governing forest areas, which are related to wildlife, which are also related to management of forest resources, which are related to giving some rights to local communities which are living in forest areas or around forest areas. And which are dependent on forest land and its resources. So basically, my purpose here is to give you a historical understanding of forest governance in India, how it evolved in colonial period, what kind of situations evolved after independence, and what kind of factors led to the enactment of Forest Rights Act, and what kind of experiences we have regarding the implementation of this act. So my purpose here is to give you a full understanding of the governance of forest areas in our country, and we will start with, of course, with historical process, and this whole presentation will be divided in uh, I will four parts. And in the first part, I will try to introduce you about the current situation of India's forests and then present the historical context of the forest governance in India. Particularly, I will focus in colonial period in the first part of my presentation. And then in the second part of my presentation, uh, I will discuss the issues and provisions related to the forest management in post-colonial India. We will try to understand certain constitutional provisions, and then we will focus on the features of forest management in post-colonial India till 1996. We will try to understand the some basic provisions of Wildlife Protection Act of 1972, Forest Conservation Act of 1980, and then we will also focus on Panchayat Extension to Scheduled Areas Act 1996. And then in the third section, I will discuss the enactment process of the Forest Rights Act and the different provisions related to this law. The enactment process of the Forest Rights Act is also important because it underlined the increased political consciousness of local communities, where local communities started to fight or mobilize themselves for their own rights. And we will find in our discussion that actually many provisions were included in Forest Rights Act due to the pressure from the many grassroots organization of tribal communities. And then in the fourth section, I will discuss the general experience of the implementation of the FRA, and I will also present certain case studies to underline the positive impact of the FRA on the political consciousness of forest dwelling communities. Maybe we will not go in the deep analysis of one case studies, but on the basis of my experiences, my field studies, I will give you one, two, or three examples just to underline that what kind of positive impact FRA has created on the lives of forest dwelling communities. Now, in this map, you can find the situation of forests in our country, and what we have to remember beyond before moving forward, that actually when you're talking about forest areas in our country, what we have to uh, remember is that forest areas in our country are not devoid of human existence. Actually, in most of the forest areas, we can find that human beings are living uh, in forest areas or around forest areas, and they are dependent on forest resources. And in most of the cases, we will also find that, or we can find actually that the local communities which are living in or around forest areas belong to Adivasi communities. And some of the Adivasi communities are part of scheduled tribes category, which is a part of our constitution, and some other communities which actually claim that we are Adivasis are not part of scheduled tribes community. So we can find that in forest areas there are different kind of communities which are living. Some of them are STs and some of them are non-STs. And in non-STs, some of them are claiming that they are actually Adivasis, but there are other communities which are dependent on forest resources, but they never claim that actually we are Adivasis. So it's a kind of a diverse kind of situation in forest areas. And with this understanding, if we'll move forward, and I'll tell you in the second section of my presentation that what kind of different what kind of areas are there related to tribal communities, primarily fifth schedule areas and sixth schedule areas. But we must remember that all forest areas or scheduled tribes areas are, I mean, areas where people related to scheduled tribes are living. Uh, these areas are not part of Schedule 5 or Schedule 6. Okay, so just I want to mention this thing that Schedule 6 is related to northeastern part of our country, and Schedule 5 is related to primarily, we can say, to the areas other than Schedule 6 areas where tribal communities are living. But there are many areas where tribal communities are living, but these areas are neither part of Schedule 6 nor Schedule 5. Okay, so it's a kind of complex situation, and I will try to make this thing clear in the second part of our presentation. But for the time being, what we have to remember is that in all forest areas or most of the forest areas, apart from wildlife, human beings are also living. And the total geographical area of forest in our country is 21.34%. The forest areas has been divided in three groups: very dense forest 3%, moderate dense forest 10%, and open forest 9%. Rest of the forest areas has degraded or negligible forests. And one important category, that is protected areas, which emerged after 1972 Wildlife Protection Act. And in this category, we can find that national parks, wildlife sanctuaries, conservation reserves, and community reserves have been created. Okay, and on this slide, you can find that in our country there are 103 national parks, 35 wildlife sanctuaries, 66 conservation reserves, and 26 community reserves. And area of protected areas network is like 1,60,897 square kilometer, and which is 4.88% of the total geographical area of the country. The idea of protected areas is really important because these areas have been created on the basis of this understanding that actually wildlife uh, will be conserved through these areas. So we can find that in protected areas, the tribal communities or other forest dwelling communities which are living there have very limited rights, and they are facing lots of problems in these areas. So basically, the idea of protected areas is really important to understand the current situation of forest governance, because in all these protected areas we can find a situation of conflict between forest department and local communities. Now I will try to give you a historical understanding of the emergence of forest governance in our India, in our country. Now it is a fact that pre-colonial rulers also intervened in forests for occasional hunting and some resources like timber, etc. But during colonial rule, the intervention increased immensely. So in uh, pre-colonial time, we can find a situation where rulers were going in forest areas, they were taking certain resources, but they were not intervening in the lives of forest dwelling communities on daily basis. But it started with colonial rule, and we can say that in pre-colonial time, tribal communities both in northeastern part and central India are living more or less an autonomous community life based on their cultural and social norms. The colonial rule made an unprecedented impact on the lives of tribal communities. Indeed, one can quickly identify two layers of processes in the colonial period vis-a-vis tribal population and forest areas. First, to ensure their imperial interests, Britishers tried to establish their monopoly over forests. And for this purpose, they used the principle of eminent domain. Uh, what is the meaning of the principle of eminent domain? The meaning is that a state has sovereignty over all lands coming within its geographical area. And then the colonial rulers also established forest department in 1864, and subsequently they enacted Forest Act 1865. And since there were many deficiencies in this act, they enacted Indian Forest Act of 1878. And in 1927 they made some specific changes to the 1878 Forest Act. And now we know the primary forest governing colonial act as Forest Act of 1927, because in 1927 act, the 81 clauses out of 84 clauses were taken from 1874 Forest Act. Through these acts, colonial rulers tried to establish their dominance over forests and their resources. Now, there was a provision in the Forest Act of 1878, which actually included in 1927 Forest Act 2. And according to that provision, Forest Department has right to declare an area as forests, and uh, through this process, they can recognize the rights of forest dwelling people. But the point here is that those people or those persons who are living in forest areas and they want to claim their rights over forest land, they must present a written proof in favor of their claims. So it was part of 1878 acts. Now, what we have to remember is that once tribal communities failed to present any kind of proof, they turned as encroachers, okay, encroachers of forest land. So through this process, actually, colonial rulers turned most of the tribal communities as encroachers on their own land. And then they uh, actually accepted some of their traditional or customary rights as concessions, because they faced lots of protests and revolts in tribal areas. So, what we have to remember is that the idea of eminent domain played an important role in turning tribals into encroachers. And what we have to remember is that even in this situation where uh, you know uh, people, I mean, tribal people were able to present some kind of proof, which was actually highly unlikely. But even in that situation, the forest department had right to, take over their land by claiming that it is necessary for the public good. And the point is that forest department had to give some kind of, compensation for taking their land. So this idea of eminent domain created a situation where tribal communities or for other forest dwelling communities became encroachers in large numbers in forest areas. Now, in colonial periods, we can also find another, parallel process where colonial state formally created a distinct category of tribes. The meaning and features of the tribe had been changed during different censuses. However, primitive and isolated lifestyles and animism, a different pattern of worship than Hinduism, were regarded as key features to define tribes. Indeed, even before the inclusion of the category of the tribe in the census, the colonial administration enacted the Scheduled Districts Act in 1874. Through this act, the idea of two kinds of tribal areas emerged, one which was living in total isolation from the rest of the country or rest of the society, and the other was partially attached to the mainstream, quote unquote, mainstream society. The colonial rulers made their policies on this understanding. Finally, they got the name of excluded areas for the northeastern part and partially excluded areas for the many tribal areas of the rest of the country through the Government of India Act 1935. The colonial rulers used the argument of tribal welfare. This system helped them enormously to establish their control in these areas. They, however, also systematically criminalized many tribal groups. Many tribal groups were included in the category of criminal tribes. So they were treated differently as criminals just due to their some kind of relationship with that particular tribe. So basically, colonial rulers started to intervene in the day-to-day lives of tribal communities, and they started to exploit forest resources more systematically. They used these forest resources to fulfill their imperial interests, and we can find, if we study any text related to tribal history, we'll find that tribal communities revolted many times against Britishers, and in response to this kind of revolt, sometimes they gave certain concessions to these tribal communities. And for example, Chota Nagpur Tenancy Act of 1909 was a result of Birsa Munda's revolt in the last decade of 19th century. So my point here is that they gave some kind of concessions to tribal communities, but largely they used their administrative tools to exploit forest resources for their own benefit. And there was another aspect of this whole process, and this aspect is related to the game of hunting. The colonial rulers, particularly, the colonial administrator of higher ranks, used to play the game of hunting, and they, killed many animals, many wildlife in forest areas of our country, which resulted in, the extinction of many species, or at least the crisis for many species of wildlife in the forest areas. And the princely rulers also played their role in this regard. There are certain research actually which underline this fact that colonial rulers, or at least some of its administrators, were very much aware about the negative impacts of the overexploitation of forest resources, and they tried to create some kind of mechanism to make forest in a better situation, or place forest in a better situation. But what we have to remember is that the larger trend of colonial rule was to systematize exploitation of forest resources. Okay, they used the forest resources in First World War and Second World War. Okay, and the important factor in all this whole process was that uh, India faced different kind of crisis after the end of colonial rule. We can say that many resources were in a situation of erosion when colonial rulers left this country. Tribal communities were in a situation of dispossession, and we faced a different kind of crisis on the front of wildlife protection too. So primarily, we faced uh, at the time of independence a different kind of situation related to forest areas. But what happened after independence? So basically, after independence, we started to work with a different kind of mindset, but that mindset was also dependent on the overexploitation of forest resources. We will discuss about this aspect in the second part of this presentation.